Picture this. It is day 3 after the grid goes down. Not a rolling blackout, not a regional outage, not a storm that knocks out power for a weekend. The entire national grid has collapsed. Financial systems have gone dark. Fuel pumps are dead. Grocery stores, which carry on average only 72 hours of food inventory, have been emptied and burned. The water treatment facilities that depend on electric pumps have stopped flowing, and the people around you, the ordinary, decent human beings you have lived next to for years, are about to become something entirely different. Because hunger does something to the human brain that no motivational speech can override. It rewires decision-making. It dismantles empathy. It strips away the social contract in layers, slowly at first, then all at once. This is not a hypothetical. This is a documented pattern. It happened in Venezuela starting in 2016. It happened in Syria. It happened during the siege of Leningrad, in post-war Germany, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, in just the first 5 days. In every single case, the data tells the same story. The people who had prepared, who understood the physics and chemistry of survival, who had internalized an actual plan grounded in how the real world works, they survived at dramatically higher rates. The people who had watched a few YouTube videos about stockpiling freeze-dried food and thought that was enough, they were the first ones gone. So before you read another word, understand this. The flaw in your survival plan is not a missing item on a checklist. It is not a missing piece of gear. The fatal flaw is that your plan was built on comfort, on optimism, on the fantasy that collapse will be temporary and managed, and someone will eventually come to help. Real collapse data says otherwise. And what you are about to read is not designed to comfort you. It is designed to save your life. Most people operate under what researchers call normalcy bias, which is the brain tendency to underestimate both the probability and the impact of catastrophic events. Studies from FEMA and post-disaster behavioral analysis consistently show that in the first 12 to 24 hours of a true grid-down scenario, roughly 60% of people take no protective action at all. They wait, they refresh news feeds on phones that are slowly draining, they assume the situation is temporary. They make tea and watch the window. And that 12 to 24-hour window is the single most valuable resource you will ever have because it is the window when movement is still relatively safe, when stores still technically exist, even if the registers do not work, when gas stations still have fuel in the underground tanks, even if the pumps are off. The people who move in that window do not do so because they are braver. They do so because they prepared their mind before the event ever happened. Now let us talk about what real collapse actually looks like. Because the version you have in your head, the Hollywood version with the lone wolf survivor navigating a wasteland, is almost certainly wrong. Real collapse is loud and social and deeply, deeply urban. The majority of people on Earth live in cities. In a genuine grid-down scenario, cities become the most dangerous places on Earth within 72 hours, but they are also counterintuitively full of resources that most people completely overlook. Understanding this duality is the first real piece of science-driven survival knowledge you need. Here is what the physics and chemistry of collapse actually tell us. Water, because it is pulled by gravity, will remain in elevated tanks, rooftop storage units, and sealed municipal water towers for days after pump failure. The average municipal water tower holds enough water to supply a city for anywhere from 1 to 3 days under normal usage. But collapse is not normal usage. Most people will not think to access these towers. Most people will not know how. Knowing that water seeks the lowest available point, knowing that every tall building has a gravity-fed emergency tank in its upper floors, knowing that cooling systems in large commercial buildings hold massive volumes of treated water. This is not a survival hack. This is basic applied physics that could be the difference between life and death. And while we are on the subject of water, let us destroy one of the most dangerous myths in all of prepper culture. The idea that you can safely drink water from urban rivers and streams by just boiling it. In a true collapse scenario, those waterways will be contaminated not just with biological pathogens, but with chemical runoff from infrastructure that is no longer being monitored or maintained. Fuel storage leaks, industrial chemical facilities, releasing uncontrolled discharge. Boiling water kills biological threats, but concentrates chemical ones. What you actually need is a 2-stage filtration system. First, a physical filtration layer to remove particulates, activated charcoal to bind chemical contaminants, and then a disinfection stage. You can build a rudimentary version of this with materials found in almost any urban building. Activated charcoal comes from burned wood that has been oxygen-starved during combustion. Find sand for physical filtration. Gravel as a pre-filter. This is not wilderness survival theory. This is chemistry that works. Now, let us talk about food, because this is where almost every survival plan falls apart completely. The average prepper thinks about food storage. They think about how much they have, where it is, how long it will last. What they almost never think about is the behavioral ecology of scarcity, which is to say, they do not think about what other people are going to do when food runs out. And here is where real collapse data becomes genuinely terrifying. In post-collapse environments, visible food stores are a death sentence. The Venezuelan crisis produced extensive documentation of this dynamic. People who openly carried food, who had visible stockpiles, who were known in their community to have prepared, became targets within days, not weeks, days. This is not because people became evil. It is because the human brain, under starvation conditions, produces the same neurochemical cascade as someone in a life-threatening emergency. Cortisol and adrenaline override prefrontal reasoning. Groups form around resource acquisition, and those groups, even loosely organized ones, will overwhelm any individual defender. The solution here is not more guns. The data does not support the lone fortress model. The solution is invisibility. Cached and distributed food stores, separated by distance, hidden inside the urban landscape in locations that require specific knowledge to access. Think about the dead spaces of a city. Maintenance corridors beneath commercial buildings, electrical equipment rooms that have secondary access, the sealed floor spaces beneath commercial flooring, the spaces inside false walls in older buildings, the forgotten storage areas beneath parking structures. These spaces exist in virtually every urban environment, and they are invisible to the desperate majority because the desperate majority does not know they are there. And this brings us to one of the most critical and least discussed survival sciences, which is navigation and movement through urban environments without using primary routes. When collapse happens, roads become choke points. They become the sites of desperate confrontation, of blockades, of fuel competition, of everything you want to avoid. But cities are not just roads. Every major urban area is underlaid with a network of maintenance infrastructure that most residents have never thought about. Utility tunnels connecting buildings, storm drainage systems large enough to walk through, rail maintenance corridors, steam distribution tunnels in older city cores. These are not secret. They are documented in engineering archives, many of which are publicly accessible at city planning offices or online through Freedom of Information frameworks. What they represent in a collapse scenario is a movement network that the majority of the population does not know exists, which means it is, for a period of time, both safe and usable. Mapping this secondary infrastructure of your city is not a paranoid activity. It is a logistics exercise. It is the same thing a military logistics officer would do when evaluating a theater of operations. You are not preparing for war. You are preparing to move yourself and your family through an environment that has become hostile, using routes that the hostile elements do not know about. The time to map those routes is before you need them, when you can do it calmly, with a notepad and a city planning database and a few afternoons of urban exploration. The time to discover them is not when a crowd is moving through the street outside. Now let us address the moment that most survival planning completely ignores, the moment of psychological collapse. Because the data from every major disaster scenario, from Katrina to Fukushima to the immediate aftermath of the 2010 Haiti earthquake, is overwhelmingly consistent on one point. The single most common cause of death in the first 72 hours is not violence, it is not dehydration, it is paralysis. It is the human brain, faced with an overwhelming and incomprehensible situation, simply refusing to make decisions. Researchers call this the freeze response. It is not cowardice, it is neurobiology. When the prefrontal cortex is overwhelmed by threat stimuli, the brain defaults to its oldest and least rational operating system, which is the limbic system, the fight-flight-freeze architecture that developed long before human beings built cities or stockpiles or plans. The way you override the freeze response is not through willpower. You cannot willpower your way out of a neurochemical shutdown. The way you override it is through preloading decisions. What this means in practice is that every major decision you might face in a collapse scenario needs to have already been made in advance, in a calm and rational state, and committed to paper in a form you can follow when your hands are shaking and your neighbor is screaming and the smoke is visible on the horizon. When do I leave? What is the trigger? Which route do I take? Where is the first cache? Who are my people and where do we meet? These decisions, made in advance, bypass the freeze response because the brain does not have to make them under stress. It just has to execute them. Execution under stress is dramatically more reliable than decision-making under stress. The military has understood this for centuries. It is the entire point of drilling, of rehearsal, of standard operating procedures. You are not a soldier, but the neuroscience applies to every human brain equally. There is also something that needs to be said about groups, because the lone survivor fantasy is not just dangerous, it is statistically absurd. The data from long-duration collapse environments is absolutely unambiguous on this point. Individuals operating alone have dramatically lower survival rates than groups of even 3 to 5 people, not because of strength in numbers in the combat sense, but because of cognitive load. A single person trying to maintain security, source water, manage food, navigate, handle medical issues, and get adequate sleep is a person who will make fatal mistakes within days. Sleep deprivation alone begins to produce cognitive impairment equivalent to legal intoxication after just 18 hours. Now imagine making life or death decisions while sleep deprived, under caloric restriction, in a high-stress environment, completely alone. The The math is brutal. A small, trusted group of people with complementary skills is exponentially more resilient than any single prepared individual. And this is not just about practical tasks. It is about psychological survival. Research from isolated and confined environments, submarine crews, Antarctic research stations, long-duration space missions, consistently shows that social bonding and shared purpose are among the most powerful predictors of psychological resilience under sustained extreme stress. Human beings are social animals. In genuine extremity, that social architecture is not a weakness. It is the most powerful survival technology ever developed. But the critical caveat, and this is where most community survival planning fails, is that trust in a collapse scenario cannot be built during the collapse. It has to exist before. And the foundation of that trust is not shared ideology or shared stockpiles. It is shared decision-making. It is having the hard conversations in advance. What are our rules about bringing in strangers? What happens if someone in the group becomes sick? What is our decision-making process when we disagree under pressure? These conversations are uncomfortable in normal times, which is precisely why most people never have them, and why most survival groups dissolve under pressure within days of a real event. The psychological edge in survival is not toughness. Toughness is a myth. The data from prisoner of war studies, from prolonged disaster scenarios, from extreme isolation research, all points to the same thing. The people who endure longest are not the hardest. They are the most adaptable and the most connected. They are the ones who can revise their mental model of the world when the world changes drastically. They are the ones who maintain small rituals of normalcy inside chaos, who find moments of humor and connection even inside horror. They are the ones who have something worth surviving for, not just something to survive on. Meaning is not soft or sentimental. In the neuroscience of extreme stress, meaning is a literal survival variable. It is what keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged and the limbic system from taking permanent control. Viktor Frankl documented this from the inside in the most extreme possible environment. The prisoners in Nazi concentration camps who survived longest were not the physically strongest. They were the ones who maintained what Frankl called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose how to respond to a given set of circumstances. That is not philosophy. That is applied behavioral science, and it belongs in your survival plan as much as water, filtration, and food caches and secondary evacuation routes. Now let us get brutally specific about the first 72 hours of a true collapse, because this window is everything. In the first 6 hours, the majority of the population is still in normalcy bias. Use this window. Move. Fill every available container with water from the tap before pressure drops. Remove cash from any available ATM in small amounts and distribute it across your person. If you have a vehicle, fill the tank immediately, because fuel will be the next thing to disappear. Make contact with your predetermined group. Do not announce your plans publicly. Do not tell neighbors you are leaving or where you are going. Social information in a collapse environment is a currency that will be used against you. In hours 6 through 24, behavioral changes will begin to become visible. Stores will be mobbed and then will burn or be shuttered. Traffic will become chaotic and then blocked. Emergency services will become increasingly overwhelmed and then effectively absent. If you have not already made your initial moves, do so before this window closes. After hour 24, movement through primary routes becomes increasingly dangerous and should be avoided entirely, in favor of your secondary infrastructure routes that you have already mapped. In hours 24 through 72, the social landscape will have reorganized. Small groups will have formed around resources. Territorial dynamics will have begun to emerge. The most dangerous element in this window is not organized violence. It is desperate individual action, which is random and therefore unpredictable. Distance and invisibility are your primary defenses. If you cannot be seen, you cannot be targeted. One last technical point that almost no survival guide addresses: information. In a grid-down scenario, the loss of internet and cellular communication is not just an inconvenience, it is a tactical vulnerability, because in the absence of information, rumor fills the vacuum, and rumor drives behavior more powerfully than fact. The group that has access to even fragmentary real information through a shortwave radio receiver, through scouts who move through the secondary infrastructure and report back, through a pre-established communication protocol with other trusted groups, has an enormous advantage over the group that is operating blind. A basic hand crank or battery-powered shortwave radio is not a luxury item. It is a command and control resource. The ability to hear emergency broadcasts from functioning parts of the country, to understand the scale and likely duration of the event, to track the movement of government or military response, changes the quality of every decision your group will make. And here is where we arrive at the place this has been leading all along. All of the techniques, the water filtration, chemistry, the secondary movement routes, the distributed cache strategy, the preloaded decision, framework, the group trust architecture, all of it is meaningless if you are reading it for the first time when the lights go out. The only thing that separates the person who survives from the person who does not is not equipment. It is not physical fitness. It is not even intelligence. It is time. Time spent building knowledge before it was urgent. Time spent making decisions before stress made decision-making unreliable. Time spent mapping routes before crowds filled the primary ones. Time spent building relationships before survival was at stake. Every piece of data, from every collapse scenario ever documented, says the same thing. The survivors prepared. Not perfectly, not with unlimited resources, not with military training or special access to information that was unavailable to everyone else. They prepared with what they had, in the time they had, before the moment arrived. And when the moment arrived, they were already in motion while everyone else was standing at the window, waiting for someone to tell them it would be okay. Nobody is coming to tell you it will be okay. That is not pessimism. That is the most liberating truth in this entire guide, because it means the outcome is in your hands right now, today, in the ordinary and uncollapsed present, before the clock starts running. What you do at this moment, before the crisis, is the only variable that has ever mattered. The victim waits for the world to stabilize. The survivor builds stability before the world requires it. Everything else is just details. And the time to work on the details is now. Let us be even more specific about something that gets glossed over in almost every survival discussion, which is the medical reality of collapse. Most people, when they think about survival medicine, think about treating gunshot wounds or broken bones, and while those scenarios do occur, the data from post-collapse environments globally tells a completely different story about what actually kills people. The leading medical killers in collapse environments are infected wounds from minor injuries that went untreated, waterborne illness from inadequate sanitation, cardiovascular events triggered by extreme physical and psychological stress, and prescription medication withdrawal, because an enormous percentage of the modern population depends on daily medication, from blood pressure drugs to insulin to psychiatric medications. And a grid-down scenario means those supply chains stop instantly. Understanding this changes your medical preparation strategy entirely. Your most valuable medical resources are not trauma supplies. They are broad-spectrum antibiotics, water purification tools to prevent the gastrointestinal disasters that kill far more people than violence, electrolyte compounds to manage dehydration, and a detailed inventory of every member of your group current medical dependencies. The last one is the most uncomfortable to address because it forces a hard conversation about who in your group has a medical dependency that cannot be sustained in a collapse, and what your plan is for that reality. There is no comfortable answer to that question. But having it unexamined is far more dangerous than confronting it directly. There is also the question of fire, which most urban survival guides treat purely as a heating or cooking tool without adequately addressing its role as a tactical and social signal. In an urban collapse environment, fire is a beacon. It announces location. It suggests resources. It draws people. The discipline of managing fire, of using the absolute minimum necessary heat source of cooking in ways that minimize smoke and light. Signature of understanding when the tactical cost of a fire outweighs its benefit is a skill that requires conscious thought before you are cold and hungry and exhausted and desperate for warmth. A small rocket stove built from urban debris, burning very small diameter wood at high efficiency, produces dramatically less smoke and light than an open fire. Understanding combustion efficiency is not hobbyist knowledge in a collapse, it is security knowledge. And food production, which everyone knows matters, but almost no one has genuinely practiced. The gap between knowing intellectually that you can grow food and actually being able to grow enough food to meaningfully supplement caloric intake under adverse conditions is enormous. Controlled environment growing, using even limited indoor space and improvised growing mediums, can produce high-calorie density crops in conditions that outdoor agriculture cannot support. Sprouts are the most undervalued survival food in existence. A small quantity of seeds can be sprouted in 3 to 5 days using nothing but water and a container, producing fresh, nutritionally dense food that requires no soil and no sunlight. The conversion rate of seeds to sprouted food by weight is roughly 1 to 6. That is not a backup plan. For a small group, that is a primary nutrition strategy that can operate indefinitely as long as seed stock is maintained. Urban foraging is the other piece that most people know about in theory but have never practiced. Cities are full of edible weeds. Dandelion, purslane, lamb quarters, wood sorrel grow in sidewalk cracks and abandoned lots and neglected park borders. But identification requires practice with living plants, not just pictures in a book, because the margin for error when foraging is absolute. The final thing, and perhaps the most important thing that no one wants to say directly, is this. Preparation is not about fear. It is not about paranoia. It is not about distrust of society or government or your fellow human beings. It is about the cold data-supported acknowledgement that complex systems fail, that the infrastructure we have built is both miraculous and fragile, and that the individual human being in a society that has normalized total dependence on that infrastructure has traded resilience for convenience in ways that become visible only when the infrastructure disappears. Every generation in human history before the last 100 years understood, in their bones, how to sustain life from first principles. That knowledge did not disappear from the human gene pool. It disappeared from the human culture, replaced by supply chains and digital systems and the profound and seductive comfort of modern life. Recovering some fraction of that knowledge is not regression. It is insurance. It is the acknowledgement that you are a biological organism in a physical world and that the social systems that currently support you, as remarkable as they are not permanent. Nobody is coming to tell you it will be okay. That is not pessimism. That is the most liberating truth in this entire guide. Because it means the outcome is in your hands right now, today, in the ordinary and uncollapsed present, before the clock starts running. What you do with this moment, before the crisis, is the only variable that has ever mattered. The victim waits for the world to stabilize. The survivor builds stability before the world requires it. Everything else is just details. And the time to work on the details is now.